Hello guys, welcome to lesson number 67 in our drawing series, Drawing Techniques for Beginners. Towards the end of the last lesson, what I said that we were going to do was we're going to start bringing in some of those mid-tone values into some of the shadows. So as you can see, I've worked quite a little bit of the wing mirror here, and I've just started to bring in a little bit of the value in and around some of this rear part of the car. Now what we really need to do today is I really need to start ramping up these dark areas, because what we're starting to do is we're starting to lose the contrast, and it's going to make it very difficult for me to know how dark I need to go in certain areas, which is what I was finding in this zone here. So what we're going to be working with today is the 2B and the 4B pencil. So I've sharpened these up. These are my grafwood, Caran D'ache grafwood pencils. And I'm just going to start layering the 2B to begin with. I've freshened up my kneaded eraser, and I'm quite happy with how it's starting to turn out. But without further ado, I'm going to just really start to ramp up the contrast, because what we're not getting at the moment is we're not getting some of that very bright shine in any of the areas in and around the windows, and some of those areas on the bodywork of the car, which is going to be so important, because whenever you're drawing reflections, whenever you're trying to create a shiny surface, it's absolutely vital that you have those very contrasting dark blacks with the very, very light, almost white areas. You know, if we look at this image here, if we look at our reference image, if we look at the white of the paper compared to certainly these two reflections here and here over onto underneath the wing mirror, they're almost the same value. So it's important that we have those, but in order to bring that contrast out and to make those areas look extremely light, we need to ramp up the contrast in these darker areas. So I think what we're probably going to do is we're definitely going to be using some of our black Prismacolor Polychromos coloured pencil in some of these dark areas. But what I want to do initially is I want to bring the value up with the graphite. Ultimately, I like to use graphite as much as I can. I'm not really a coloured pencil artist, so even though we use some of the black Prismacolor, some of the black Polychromos sometimes, it's my sort of wish to get as much of it done in the graphite. If this is the first time that you visited my channel, thank you so much for visiting. It's a pleasure to be drawing along with you. My aim with this series is really to take you through some of the steps that I'm getting quite accustomed to now. I've been drawing using these various techniques that I'm trying to teach you for well over 3 years now, and I would call myself self-taught. I haven't been to a traditional art school or anything like that. I did what I'm guessing a lot of you guys are doing at the moment, which is trawling through various Facebook groups, YouTube channels, things like that, and just trying to pick up techniques. And I can remember being in that position. I eventually ended up taking some online classes which were invaluable. They gave me a structure and an understanding of how to start and how to create something that was realistic. But I understand that all costs money. So what I'm trying to do is package together everything that I've learnt recently in some bite-size, I would say, videos. I'm trying to keep these videos down to around about the 30-minute mark. And then what we do is you get a general idea of what we've been doing during that half an hour, and then you're going to go and continue with that. The projects that we've done so far, they're round about 10 sessions. Some have been slightly over 10 and some have been slightly below, but 10 sort of sessions with a little bit of work in between the sessions is what we've been aiming for. And I think that I can kind of get across a lot of the messages and the thoughts that are going through my head in that amount of time. If you haven't checked out my playlist called Essential Pencil Skills, go and have a look at that, because a lot of what I talk about might seem a little bit odd if you're sort of jumping into this. Like I say, if this is the first video that you've come across, you won't understand what a tapered stroke is and how to build up values and what the tooth of the paper may be necessarily. If you do, fantastic, you know, jump in and give it a go. But the technique that I use is we build up the value of the graphite, starting with a harder pencil and moving up through the softer pencils. So your harder pencils are the pencils that end in H, so 9H, all the way up to a standard H pencil, and then it goes into an HB. Or it's possibly an F in between there somewhere. But the harder pencils, what we're tending to do is we're tending to get a good coverage, but we're not getting much darkness out of the harder pencils. We're starting to fill the tooth of the paper up. And then we start to work in the softer pencils, the B pencils, the 2B, the 4B, the 6B, the 8B, the 9B, 7B, whatever you've got to hand. And it's that layering. Now, one really important message that I have to try and get across to you is this value that we're working on here. Although I'm now working in a 2B, it doesn't mean that I won't go back down to the HB. So I will possibly layer in certain areas some HB and then some more 2B and then move up to the 4B. So it's this constant toing and froing up and down the grades of pencil, that what that does is it gives us a beautiful saturation of value, and it allows us to gauge when we're dark enough in certain areas. And that's why one of the things that I really do emphasize is start working in your darkest areas to begin with. I've heard a lot of artists over the last few years that talk about working from the lightest areas. Now, I am not an advocate for that. Reason being, if I started working in these very light areas, and let's say I was working in these very light reflections and I went up to let's say an HB, that would mean to get the contrast in these darker zones, I would have to then go up to something ridiculously dark, maybe even up to a 9B, before I even started to create any sense of realism. And it just means that if I'm able to work in the darkest areas, I can then bring the value up in the lighter areas, and I can reach a point where I'm happy with the contrast. One of my cornerstones, one of my most important areas for creating realistic drawings, realistic paintings, whether it's digital, whether it's marker work or whatever it may be, is you must create striking contrast. So I need to identify where my darkest zones are and keep pushing that. You know, if we look at our reference image of this car now, this area that I'm working in now, this sort of air intake, on our reference image it is absolutely black. Now you're never going to be able to get black with a pencil. Graphite pencils, even in the higher Bs, it is still a dark grey. But if you understand contrast and you understand that by making some areas very light, you can make one area appear to be darker than you've actually made it. That's the skill. Now what I'm also doing is I'm laying down these pencil strokes. I'm pulling the pencil towards me, and I'm trying to keep them as close together as I can. It's a, I guess you could call it a very sort of very structured crosshatch. Now if you're not aware of what crosshatching is, you'll see an awful lot of fantastic work. I see a lot of it over on Instagram. People have drawn some wonderful portraits and pictures, and crosshatching is really just a series of lines that cross one another. So you're not always working in the same direction. You're going vertical, horizontal, And to make a value look darker, you're creating less space between the lines. To make an area look lighter, you're creating more space between the lines. So you're letting the colour of the paper come through. And you can get some wonderfully realistic looking drawings, although they're not what we would call hyper realistic, because you can see that it is pencil strokes. Now what we're aiming to do here is, although we are building up our value with a series of lines, we are aiming to keep them close together. And by keeping them close together, we get this very, very smooth value. Now that makes it very, very easy as we go through our drawing to get smooth transitions from one area to another. So if we were looking to draw a face, for example, you wouldn't have these very harsh lines that we've got on this car. So we've got these very hard edges between the darks and the lights on this car, which is obviously because what we're looking at has got these sort of edges to it. Now if we look at a face, what we tend to have is we tend to have much smoother rounded edges. So those areas that I've just worked in, I'm actually going to pull a 6B out. Let's see how much we can increase the value of the 6B. Because again, I want to have this very, very dark layer in there, so that I can then bounce off of that and see how dark I need to make the surrounding areas. We need mid-tones, we need the very, very dark tones, and we need some very highlighted areas. And identifying your darkest zones early on in your sort of composition of your drawing is super important. And by working in the darkest areas to begin with, getting that initial layer of graphite down, it means that every time you go over that area, even if you're going over a lighter area at the same time, your darkest area is going to remain the darkest area. And that sounds like common sense, but what can also happen sometimes is if you're not defining your darkest areas constantly, it becomes very easy to lose your darkest areas and have this kind of wishy-washy mid-tone. Everything's a mid-tone. I see some brilliant drawings that people have done, again over on Instagram and things like that, and you know they've obviously spent an awful lot of time plotting their drawing out. They've got some fantastic proportions in there. The perspective's great and whatnot. But what they've then done is they've just gone over it, and they've got pretty much a mid-tone and a slightly lighter mid-tone, and it just ruins the sense of realism. I don't know who it is, but I follow somebody over on Instagram, and they draw these wonderful cars, all manner of different cars, and every single picture that I see, I just want to scream out, just get some contrast in there, because you know we're drawing cars and things like that, and there is absolutely black on a car. You know, the tyres are black, and some of the trim are black, and the shadows are black. And this person that I follow, although their drawings are very, very well drawn out and structured, there's no contrast in there. There's very little dark areas. You know, the colour of the tyres, which theoretically should be one of your darkest areas, is no darker than sort of the side panel. So it's very, very hard to create that realism. So contrast is for me, it's super important, and it's probably the area that over the time that I've been drawing is the one that I've had to work on the most and keep pushing. You know, there's a lot of people over on our Facebook group, which is called Tutorial Tuesdays Beginners to Pro. If you haven't already joined that, go and join us. Request to join and I'll accept that. But essentially, one of the things that I go on about in the group, which is where a lot of people share their work, you know, they draw along with me in our projects and they share various works, but the amount of people that have had to say, look, trust in the process and go darker, you know, really bring the value up in some of those mid-tone areas, but that then means you've got to ramp up the value in the contrasting areas, which then, when you start to take some of the highlighted areas out with your erasers, really starts to pump the realism up. So I'm quite happy with how this 6B is laying down now. You might ask why I didn't just start with the 6B. Why have I gone through this process? Well, I'm sure some of you will have noticed that when you start with a very soft pencil just on the white piece of paper, you get a very grainy, toothy look, which again takes that sense of realism away. So what we do is, with the harder pencils, we are filling the tooth of the paper, we're conditioning the paper to then allow us to go in with our softer pencils and really get a beautiful coverage. We're not using blending stumps. So now I've got a good coverage in there. I'm going to come back in with the 2B, which you may feel is a little bit odd, but what this does is it really starts to almost blend. So I'm starting to move some of the softer pencil that's already under there from the 6B. I'm starting to fill out some of those pitted areas, those areas that, because obviously we're not using a very, very, very smooth surface, we're using paper which has got a tooth to it. It's fibres, built up fibres that have been compressed down in factories, but nonetheless it's not a completely smooth surface, and nor do we want it to be a completely smooth surface. But what coming back over with this 2B now does is it just starts to fill out some of the pits of the paper. Now the other thing that I really do recommend that you do, although I'm not doing it too much in the video because I obviously want to try and keep the paper orientated as best as I can, so that you can see, you know, where we're working. I'm going to work in this back section again now. Don't be afraid to turn your paper around. Don't be afraid to make your pencil strokes overlap one another. When you first start learning this sort of hatching technique where we are just building up values with series of lines, it's actually quite difficult to get your pencil strokes close together, and you do leave a little bit of white in between. Now if you then go over that area with a different direction of pencil stroke by simply turning the paper, just so that you've, you know, like I've just done there, so you're always keeping the paper orientated so that you're able to pull it towards you. Pull the stroke towards you. We're not scribbling. We're trying as best as we can to build the layers up with our tapered stroke pulling towards us. Getting the pressure right is also critical. It would be easy for me to push really hard with this 6B pencil and get a very, very dark line. It's going to do a couple of things though that I want to try and avoid. First thing is it's going to dull my pencil very, very quickly. I'm going to be going through pencils extremely regularly, which again we don't need to do. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to damage the paper. So I'm going to score the paper. That makes it very difficult for me to remove the graphite. So this technique of layering and building the values up with a series of lines using minimal pressure allows me, if I need to, I could entirely erase this. I could absolutely erase this without any issues and start over. But what that does allow me to do, now I'm not planning on starting this again. I can't remember the last time I had to redo a drawing from scratch. We make our corrections as we go along, and very rarely will we be making our corrections with an eraser. My eraser is used for bringing highlights out. It's very rarely used for making corrections. We've made all of the errors when we plotted our drawing out to start with. We made it as accurate as possible. We got as much information down on the paper to build from, And then we went from there. So the stage that we're at now, I can make most of my corrections with my pencil rather than the eraser. But this technique of layering allows me to remove areas of graphite that I want the drawing to look slightly lighter, which again is going to be a constant process. It's not just going to be something that I do right at the end. But you will learn all about this if you just check out the Essential Pencil Skills. You can go through any of the videos that we've done recently, and you'll hear me going on about these things. But the other thing that's really important, I didn't mention there, was the pressure of the pencil. Now I'm building the value up, not by pressing hard, but by going over the same area with more strokes. So, for example, this darker area here hasn't necessarily had more pressure applied to it than the lighter area. All it has is it's had more applications of the pencil. So I've had more lines laying over the top of one another than I have in the lighter areas. So the pressure's the same. It's the amount of value that I'm getting by layering. I'm getting more graphite off of my pencil with each stroke. Okay, so the only thing that I will use to, you know, what you would deem as blending is I do use this very soft brush. A makeup brush will do, and I just like to just brush some of the graphite around. Now these Caran D'ache grafwood pencils that I use are very soft. I'm just going to clean up a little bit of the edge around our car here. I can just see some of the graphite that's moving around, and again this is a constant project of cleaning up the edges. Don't leave it till the end. You're going to have so much graphite embedded down into the tooth of the paper that it's going to be quite tricky to do that. Okay, so let's have a look at this zone here. Now I know that it seems like we're making quite slow progress with this. We've been working in these darker areas pretty much every video so far. It's the areas that we laid our initial 2H and HB pencil down, and we're sort of there again with it. But because these are the darkest areas, it's going to take the longest amount of time to build the value up here. And then once we start getting into those mid zones and the highlighted areas, there's going to be a lot less drawing to do. If you compare the amount of pencil strokes that we're having to put in to these dark zones compared to the amount that we're going to have to put into some of these lighter areas, we're going to actually allow the paper to do a lot of the work for us there. So having some patience, not getting frustrated with how long it takes to build this value up. It will be worth it in the end, I can promise you that. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, guys. The subscribers are building nicely. We're almost at 4,000, which is unbelievable. Like I say as well, join the Facebook group. I'm possibly slightly biased, but I do think out of all of the groups that I'm sort of a member of over on Facebook, a lot of the art groups, the Tutorial Tuesdays one tends to be more friendly, much more open to helping one another rather than criticism. And I'm happy to say that I'm not seeing too many excuse me, I'm not seeing too many spammy posts. There's been a few over the festive season, these silly posts that you'll no doubt be aware of if you've been a member of any other art group over on Facebook for a while. But these silly, they almost look like dating website posts and things like that on art groups, and I don't really understand why people would be posting such nonsense. But you know, like I say, I'm happy to report that we're not getting too much of that over on our page. So join that, share some of your work, let us know who you are and where you're from and what projects you're currently working on. We're all busy with our lives, and it's nice to sometimes just share what we're doing. Get some, you know, constructive criticism if need be, if you're asking for that. If you don't want constructive criticism, then that's absolutely fine. One tip that I've just used myself there is I like to try and keep the paper orientated the same way as often as I can. So the reference image and my image the same way. It just allows your eye to see things in the correct orientation. You're not going to make any mistakes with angles or values and things like that. So I always try to keep my actual drawing the same way around, or as close to being the same way around as possible as the reference image is. So that's another layer now of 2B in this darker zone. The tapered stroke that I'm also using, you'll notice that I'm holding the pencil quite a long way away from the actual end of the pencil, so I'm not bearing down on the nib, and that gives me a lovely angle to work at, which actually self-sharpens the lead. So you'll very rarely see me sharpen my pencils, certainly not in a half an hour sitting. I do tend to freshen the pencils up before I start a new video. But I will continue after this session. I will continue for possibly another 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and I won't need to sharpen the pencils in that time. I'm turning my pencil every few strokes so that I've always got a fresh part of the graphite. And again, I'm not pressing on too hard. I'm not using the paper as like a sandpaper, and really getting lots of value off and lots of graphite with every stroke. It's an exercise in patience as much as anything. Okay, so I am slightly tempted now. I'm going to come in with my Polychromos. It's a Schwarz black, it's a coloured pencil, and I'm just going to start to ramp up this area here. Now this is a black, and again I'm going to use this pencil crayon, this coloured pencil, in the same way that I've been using the other pencils, and I'm using a tapered stroke. What I'm finding is I have to press on a little bit harder now with this. It's obviously a slightly different material, and we're working over graphite, but don't press on so hard that you start getting streaky lines in there. Now the beauty with this method is I can actually still go over this area with a soft pencil, so the 6B or the 7B, and I can still increase the value. So again, just like with the pencils, I'm not pushing on as hard as I can here and going to the extent of the colour, the extent of the pencil. But what I am doing is I'm putting another layer on top. Now this is quite often something that I do towards the end of my drawings, just to really add that X factor, that finishing touch, just pulling out some of those darker areas. But I do really want to try to build this contrast up straight away, so that we can work from that. Now in hindsight, what I would have done differently next time if I was to do this again is I would have used a charcoal pencil in these areas. I used something called Wolf Carbon, which is I guess it's a mix between a charcoal and an actual pencil. It's not as soft as a charcoal, but you do get some very, very dark blacks. I recently did a picture of 2 aircraft for a pilot. It was a commission piece, and I used the Wolf Carbon in the darkest areas, the air intakes, a little bit like this car actually, the nose cone and things like that, and then worked in the pencil, the graphite after that. Now I would potentially do that with this if I were to do it again. But you can see we're getting some lovely contrast in there now. I'm liking the look of this, and this area is the area that I've worked in mostly. So there's a lot more work gone into these areas of the car already. So what I'm going to do, ready for the start of the next lesson, is I'm going to bring this rear area, this area here, this wheel arch at the bottom, and these dark shadows within the windows. I'm going to bring those up to this same value. So I'm going to go in with the 2B, I'll go in with the 6 or the 7B, whatever it was that we were using. We were using a 6B there. And then I'm going to use the black Polychromos. That's the areas that I'm going to really focus on. So for the start of the next lesson, take these dark areas to the darkest that you can get them without just going in too heavy with the pencil. So stay light, keep layering. So I'm just changing the direction of my pencil strokes here, and I'm finding that I'm able to get a lovely smooth value. And then what we're going to then be able to do for the next lesson is start to bring these values up in the wing mirror in the back area of the car, which will then hopefully give us our 3 main values. We're going to have our very dark tones in these shadowed areas, followed by the mid tones, which we're going to be going up to maybe a 2B and maybe even a 4B in some of those areas. They're just a combination of pencils actually. And then we're going to have some very light highlighted areas which will then really start to set the piece off. So although it looks as though we're quite a long way off anywhere near completing this, once we've got these dark zones in, I do think that the drawing will really flow, and we will start to really kick on with it. So again, once again, thank you so much for supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for all the lovely comments. We've had a fantastic 2019, which we're just about coming up to the end to. I'm really looking forward to 2019 and seeing where that takes us. Like I say, don't forget, give this video a like, thumbs up. If you've got any questions, just ask me a question in the comments below or over on the Facebook group. That's Tutorial Tuesdays Beginners to Pro. I'm over on Instagram as well, so go and have a look at that. That's ArtisticN1K. I'll follow back if you request a follow on that. And I hope you're all doing well. I'm looking forward to see how you get on with this, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe, smack the notifications button, follow me on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter.